guest speaker today, who is delivering a lecture on the institutional impact on economic growth and improved living standards. Professor Daron Acemoglu, Professor of Economics at MIT, Boston, and author of Why Nations Fail. Now, it's not easy to try and reduce Professor Daron Acemoglu's CV into something that is portable for a few minutes. But for those who don't know, he's a Turkish-born American economist, and he has taught at MIT since 1993. He is currently the Elizabeth and James Killian Professor of Economics at MIT, that very famous Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Born to Armenian parents in Istanbul, he was educated in the UK and completed his PhD at the LSE, London School of Economics, 25. He then lectured for a year before joining MIT. He was awarded the John Bates Clark Medal in 2005, and he is very well known for his work on political economy. Naturally, he has authored hundreds of papers and co-authored them with his longtime collaborators, Simon Johnson, James Robinson. And with Robinson, he authored The Economic Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy in 2006 and Why Nations Fail in 2012. That book, the latter, is an influential book on the role that institutions play in shaping nations' economic outcomes. This prompted wide scholarly and media commentary. He is described as a centrist. He believes, I'm told, in a regulated market economy. He regularly comments on political issues, economic inequality, and a variety of specific policies. He is, of course, a fellow of the United States National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Econometric Society, the European Economic Association, and other learned societies. Research Associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a Senior Fellow at the Canadian Institute of Advanced Research. Editor of Econometrica, an academic journal published by the Econometric Society from 2011 to 2015. He noted that most of his research has been motivated by trying to understand the sources of poverty. His research includes a wide range of topics, including political economy, human capital theory, growth theory, economic development, innovation, labor economics, income and age inequality, etc. I can see he's getting a bit restless, and for very good reason. He has no need to establish his academic credentials because he's invited by FirstBank, and we all know why he's here. We warmly welcome him, and I invite him now to come and deliver his lecture on the institutional impact on economic growth and improved living standards.
Water here. I have a lot to talk about, so I need water. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. I have met wonderful hospitality in a very warm welcome in a very warm country, and I'm really cherishing this visit, and I thank the FirstBank for inviting me here and giving me an opportunity to talk to all of you. And I am particularly happy actually to combine three big strands of my research that I believe have important relevance for the future of the emerging world and the future of Nigeria. One of those is Why Nations Fail, which was part of my remit in this invitation to talk about. But I'm going to start actually with something else, with the prospects for the world economy in an age of automation, because it is a topic not only dear to my heart, but one that has been for too long ignored in the developing world because its implications are going to be sweeping. And then I will talk about how to tie that with the themes of Why Nations Fail. And then I will transition and talk about a new book that James Robinson and I are publishing, which will come out in a couple of months' time, which really links all of these themes and has quite a bit, I think, to tell us about where to go from here. So without further ado, I will get started, and I have some charts and markers that I'm going to show you as we go arguing a little bit. It really needs to be embedded in inclusive institutions. Is critical, has been critical for the developed world, and it will be more and more vital for the emerging world, especially countries such as Nigeria, to achieve. But it will also face some new and formidable challenges. And understanding what I mean by high quality growth and what those challenges are is really critical. So let me outline what I mean by high quality growth. Of course, it is economic growth. That's very important. We all know that in this room. But it is also economic growth based on employment growth, job creation. This is critical for the developed world. It is even more critical for the developing world. You can grow. You know, Saudi Arabia, Russia, at some point Nigeria, and other countries grew based on oil. That's not enough. You really need to create jobs, both for shared prosperity and for bringing the whole society together. And employment growth is not enough either. You really need growth of wages and earnings for all groups in society. For women and men, for different regions, and for different education groups. And the third element of high quality economic growth is that in this modern world, in this modern economy, health and education have become imperatives. So it has to be growth that simultaneously invests in and exploits the human capital of the people to the fullest, which means you have to keep on investing in education and health, something that's quite lacking in many countries in the developing world, including Nigeria. All of these are going to be made feasible only if you have productivity growth, meaning if you can increase how efficiently and effectively you use your resources. So the issue of high quality growth is intimately linked to productivity growth and how we use those productivity gains for investing in the people, and how we create jobs, for the future. But perhaps not enough recognized on the African continent and many other parts of the world. The barriers ahead of high quality growth have become much more formidable. They are led by changes in the nature of technology, which I'm going to put under the rubric of automation. That's what I'm going to spend a bit of time first. In that context, I will show you why, in fact, high quality growth has been absent in the developed world. That the last 25 years have been remarkable in lack of high quality growth in the US, underpinning some of the problems that the US is facing right now. And that those wins are actually very relevant for the developing world. Then I will talk about the international institutional slump and why inclusive institutions, and in particular democracy, is key for high quality growth, but why it's suffering and the challenges that that poses for countries such as Nigeria. And then I will briefly talk about the international dimension, briefly, because I really don't want to overstay my welcome. I have so much to talk about. But also because we have a panel, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the international dimension on the panel. So I invite you to please ask me more about the international dimension in the context of the panel, because I'm not going to have time to talk about everything I want to say on that one. Actually, there are two very different narratives if you read the business pages of newspapers in the US or in Europe, you will hear the challenges and the difficulties and the failures I will talk about are not emphasized enough. Rather, you hear things such as this. Ray Kurzweil is the chief scientist and engineer of Google and has been one of the many voices heralding the dawn of a new bright age of machines that are so productive. So he says artificial intelligence will reach human capabilities, do everything that humans can do by 2029. Actually, he had originally said 2020, but he pushed it forward. And then 1 billion-fold, bringing an age of such plenty that we haven't ever even come too close to experience. If we are really in the midst of such plentifulness, we should be so happy. We can feed everybody, poverty can end, and can invest in as much education and health you want to have. All around the world, not just in the US. But of course, this is fantasy. Reality is very different. Reality is very different because high quality growth, as I will show you, has become much harder. And let me illustrate that with the US first. This is productivity growth in the US, what economists call total factor productivity growth. It is an important concept and I want to emphasize it for 30 seconds. This answers the following question, very simple. If next year you have exactly the same labor, the same human capital and the same capital that you have, but just improve your technology, how much more gross domestic product, how much more goods and services can you produce? And in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the US economy achieved remarkable total factor productivity growth. In the 50s, for example, it was over 3%. So if you did nothing else, you did not invest more and you did not build more human capital in the US, you would still produce 3% more every year because we are becoming so much more efficient. And that efficiency is really the heart of high productivity growth. That efficiency is what every country, developed or developing, has to strive for, because that's where the origins of riches lie. I'm going to talk about this over and over again in the next 45 minutes or so. But look at it, the white bar. Since the 1980s, the US economy has been failing to achieve anything close to what it used to do in terms of total factor productivity growth. Productivity growth has been slow, and it has had major implications. This is what high quality growth looks like in the US between 1947 and 1987. What I'm showing you is what happens to total payments to labor, both employment and wages. Think of it as the employment level times the average wage. And its growth is remarkable, about 3% a year, or per capita about 2% a year. Every year employers paid more, and in a very steady manner, a little bit of wiggle, recessions and everything. But employers wanted more labor, employed more labor, paid more labor. This is how high quality growth looks like. But look at what it looks, the same thing from 1987 onward. First it slows down, anemically growth. And then since 2000, way before the Great Recession, nothing to do with the financial crisis at all, it stops. Employers are not paying more to labor. They're not employing more, they're not paying more. And of course, we can unpack that. This is the employment rate of prime age workers in the US. From 1980 onwards, you see that huge increase? That's women. That's employment for all. Women are coming more and more into the labor force. The US economy is really growing by exploiting more of its capabilities. But then look at it, what happens from 2000 onwards. It declines, again, way before the Great Recession. Women's growth of labor force stops, That's a big problem because the US has not reached the, say, Scandinavian or levels of women's employment yet. And men leave the labor force. These are men between the ages of 25 and 54. They should all be working. They're not working anymore. From 95% just down to the low 80s. But this is even more telling about what I mean by high quality growth, and something very important for the developing world to remember. I'm showing real wages. This is for men, but the women looks very similar, but I wanted to separate it, and just one chart is enough. This is for men, for 5 different education units. Starting in 1963. The light blue in the middle, those are college graduates. The red are those with less than high school education, and the dark blue at the top, those are the postgraduates, people with masters and PhDs, for example, or professional degrees. Look at it from the 1960s, and this goes back similar, from the 1960s to the mid-70s. All 5 of these, high school graduates, high school dropouts, workers with 2 years of college, 4 years of college, postgraduate degrees, they're all growing together. This is the tide that lifts all boats. That is high quality growth. Everybody's wages is increasing at the same time. But then, look at how the picture changes from 80s onwards. Even the college graduates, the light blue figure, you know, in a country in Africa, college graduates, you know, we would love to have more of them. That's a blessing for the human capital of the workforce. But even the college graduates, they're not seeing much of a wage growth. And if today in the US, you are a high school graduate, man, and your father was a high school graduate man, 30 years ago, your father would have earned 30% more in real terms than you do. That is a telltale sign of low quality growth. And this is not unique to the US, we've seen. Wage growth has been very slow, and it's been very uneven. Inequality has increased and has left many, many people, the majority of Americans, behind. Why? We get a little bit of a sense of it by looking at what's going on with occupations. The yellow bars are there in the middle. Those are the factory workers, clerical workers, the middle class of America. If you wanted to ask, where does the middle class reside? It would have been in the heartland of the US and in occupations on factory floors and in offices. And those are the occupations that are disappearing both for college graduates and for men and women of less than college. This is a large part of the reason. This is what factory floors look like in many parts of the world today. This is a car factory. If you went there 25 years ago, you would have seen bustling with people screwing in, attaching, assembling, painting, checking, verifying parts of the car. That's gone. What you don't see on the factory floor are people. You have industrial robots. And the occupations that I just showed you that have disappeared are exactly those where industrial automation and office automation have made the greatest strides, as I will show you in a second. And artificial intelligence, though it is not achieving what Ray Kurzweil said, it has not multiplied our productivity, and certainly it's not going to replace humans by 2029, nothing close to it. But it is the next phase of this automation. Now, at this point, you may ask several questions. Are these all related? What's the evidence? Even if they are, why is that relevant to the developing world? And how does it really integrate with the institutions that I've already emphasized? And I will try to answer those questions now. First, it is not just for the US. This is all around us. Look at the same chart that I just showed you for the US with the occupations. Now I'm showing you for all of the OECD. And every OECD country, you see the same thing. The middle class occupations have been disappearing. Those red bars are going down. The last 20 years have witnessed the disappearance of factory floor jobs and clerical jobs in offices. But perhaps you'll say, this is just a developed world phenomenon. Why do we have to worry about this in Nigeria? There are no industrial robots in Nigeria. But first of all, they're not too far. They are all around the world. But secondly, even for countries that are not adopting industrial robots, the implications are very deep and major. This map of the world is colored with the distribution of robots around the world. Unfortunately, very little data for Africa, but we know the very little data reflects that industrial robots have not made big inroads. But look at it around much of the world. You see that they've spread way beyond the developing world. In fact, the US is not even a leader. The darkest colors are Germany, Japan, and South Korea. And that reflects another major thing, which perhaps I don't have time right now, but if people want to pick up on during the discussion, I would gladly talk a lot about, because that's yet another aspect that I've spent a lot of time thinking and writing about, demographic change. The developed world is aging, with major implications, and the developing world isn't. And this has created a huge set of opportunities and challenges for the next 20 years that are also important to be aware of. But unfortunately, I'm not going to have time to talk about that. But the other reason that all of this automation is first-order relevant for Nigeria and for the emerging world is that even if you don't adopt robots yourself, the fact that the world does means the game has changed. Mexico is a case in point. North of Mexico boomed for 30 years because they became integrated as part of the supply chain of US manufacturing. And then the last 15 years, all of those jobs have been disappearing because as automation goes on in the US, those jobs come back. So the growth path that Taiwan, South Korea, later China, Malaysia have followed, start by using your low-cost advantage in manufacturing. That is not going to be open to countries anymore in the age of automation. And that are going to be even more critical for the developing world, for the challenges that Nigeria will face and will have to succeed in the next 25 years. You might say, but really, what do we know that this process of automation is really at the root of this very complex changes in employment, wages, occupations? Well, this is stuff I have done quite a bit of work investigating, and I'll just summarize it with one chart, just humor me. This is what happened in the US as robots got adopted in different parts of the US. And on the vertical axis, you have wages. And on the horizontal axis, you have the extent of robotization in the local labor market. And you see what's going on. The places that have adopted more robots, they have seen the lower wage growth. It's places like Detroit, Wilmington, Defiance City, Ohio. Those are the industrial heartlands where auto manufacturing, electronics, metalworks are. All of those sectors you see being completely transformed. And that means a very different world for countries that are going to get to this stage in the next 20 years. A sweeping set of changes that we have to be aware of. But how can we prepare ourselves for that? There's only one answer to that, and it is about institutions. But before I go there, let me also try to dispel one other set of incorrect narratives about robots. When people see the research that shows how automation has changed the landscape, one conclusion that they jump to is to say, oh my God, the world has changed, the end of work has come. There will not be work for anybody. Robots and artificial intelligence will do all the work, and we're doomed. So from the euphorically optimistic type of narrative that you hear from Silicon Valley, you come to the other extreme that is doomed for the developed and the developing world as machines take over everything. But that also misses the point. It misses the point because it misunderstands about the substitution of machines for human labor, which is a major, not only, but a major driver of economic growth. The British Industrial Revolution started with automation. The advances in weaving and spinning that mechanized production were all about automation. And mechanization of agriculture, something that the developing world unfortunately has lagged behind, is also automation. But none of these waves of automation have brought doom. They have brought difficulties and they have brought hardship. But in many instances, we have found ways of turning that technology around to make it work for ourselves. And let me give you one little illustration of that from the mechanization of agriculture in the US, because I think it's actually quite relevant for the future challenges that the developing world will face. So starting in 1850 with mechanical plows and then tractors and other machinery, agriculture became mechanized, hugely mechanized. Its share in GDP dropped, its share in employment dropped very sharply. Americans in the beginning of the 19th century were farmers. 70% were working in agriculture. By 1930, there were few farmers left. Agriculture became completely capital intensive. You know, you think of agriculture as manual labor. It played a role, but today, if you go to Europe, if you go to the US, and this is the same in the middle of the 20th century, labor plays very little role in agriculture. The share of labor in agriculture is actually the lowest of all the other sectors. But you know, what happened? The left figure. What happened is that as labor left agriculture, the rest of the economy also changed. Industry, factory floor jobs and services and trade, they started expanding, creating new tasks, new occupations, new industries. And at the same time as labor was being freed from agriculture, those sectors started expanding, taking that labor in and employing it even more productively than it used to do in agriculture. How much of the revenue or the value added goes to labor? That drops sharply, that's the red curve there, in agriculture, but at the same time you see it increase in industry. None of this was before a lot of hardship befell many Americans. You know, you read the books of John Steinbeck. They were real. They showed all the difficulties that many people face. So it wasn't shared prosperity at first. But society found, with the ingenuity of entrepreneurs and the support of government, it found ways of turning technology around to work for the people more broadly. And one important ingredient, and without that it would not have been possible to do that blue rising up and soaking all the labor and creating the foundation of shared prosperity. Human capital. The people who were employed in industry, in services. They were clerks, they were factory floor workers. They were much more educated than the agricultural world. And that was made feasible because around that time, starting at the end of the 19th century, US started one of the biggest drives to increase human capital. High schools were spread all around the country. And it was those high school graduates who eagerly grabbed these new jobs and transformed them. Health and education. Perhaps you could have done it in the beginning of the 19th century, it was agriculture, but not even in the beginning of the 20th century, and certainly not in the 21st century. So now, we come to how is it that societies make way for technology to really unleash this capacity for becoming the tide that lifts all boats. And that's where institutions are key. High quality growth is only feasible with inclusive institutions. Inclusive institutions that invest in health and human capital, that create a legal environment that treats people equally, that creates opportunities for everybody, that protects people in the law, that does not enshrine privilege and hierarchy. And all of those need to have political foundations. They are just democracy. They're much more than democracy. And there are ways of making democracy work, and there are ways of making democracy fail. But democracy, people having a voice, is a critical element of that. It's one, but critical element. And I want to focus on that aspect of inclusive institutions, though, of course, if I had time, I would have talked much more about other aspects of inclusive institutions too. And I want to talk about democracy for three reasons. One is that it is imperfect but still critical. Second is that it is under renewed attack, and the nature of its benefits are underappreciated and belittled. A big, big mistake that I want to act as a partial corrective to. But let me start with the attack on democracy. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, there was a renewed optimism about how the whole world would become democratic. Many people jumped on that bandwagon, but no one as enthusiastically as Stanford political scientist Francis Fukuyama, who wrote a book, or read an article, entitled The End of History, followed by a book with the same title. He said this is the age of the unabashed victory of economic and political liberalism. By political liberalism, he meant democracy as opposed to socialist politics, and economic liberalism, he meant the market. And indeed, as his advisor and eminent political scientist Samuel Huntington also emphasized, with the third wave, there was a wave of democracy spreading around the world, including in Africa, especially in Latin America, South Europe, parts of Asia. But look at it today. This data is directly from the Freedom House report of the last year, or this year. According to the Freedom House, the last 12 years, the number of countries where democratic institutions and respectful civil rights and civil liberties has gone back, every year has exceeded those in which there has been improvement. This does not look like the age of democracy or the end of history. It looks like the retrenchment, slide of democracy. But then the narrative continues. Democracy is problematic. In this day and age, perhaps you need firm leadership. You need leaders who impose their will, make the right policy choices, and avoid the hurly-burly of democracy. In China, in Africa, you hear that rhetoric a lot. Even in the US nowadays, you hear that rhetoric a lot. China, Russia, they are acting more and more like role models for many countries. And it is actually, I'll come back to that in a second, it is part of the international strategy of dictatorships to help create kindred spirits, a bloc of non-democracy. So the story goes, yes, democracy is something that you may want to enjoy, but it's become more costly if you want economic success. Don't go down the path of democracy, especially for developing countries. I want to argue that that's wrong. That's very wrong. In fact, the data speak very loudly on this point. They speak so loudly that I'm just going to show you the data. That's it. That's the data. What this is, I'll tell you, it's very easy. I've taken every country, every year, from 1950 to 2015, and classified them as democracies or non-democracies. The year when a non-democracy becomes a democracy, that's year 0. And then I plot their GDP per capita, how much goods and services they're producing, relative to other countries in that year. So this is like a transparent summary of what goes on around democratization. 0 is where you democratize. There are two things in this figure that are particularly noteworthy. One is that, look at countries just before 0. That's that big slide down. The big cliff. There's a reason for that. Non-democracies don't go away peacefully and out of their own volition. The Chinese Communist Party or Putin in Russia, or military dictatorships in West Africa or the rest of Africa, they don't go by saying, okay, we've had enough. We think democracy is going to be much better, we'll just put ourselves out of the way. No, they go when they lose legitimacy, when the opposition to them mounts, and that happens most strongly and forcefully in the middle of recessions. Dictatorships typically fall when their mismanagement of the economy becomes so overwhelming that the economy tanks. That's a big drop. And then they have no choice, but in the face of the demands from society, they make way for something else, typically democracy, but sometimes under dictatorship. But the second point is much more important for, if there's going to be another second takeaway from my talk, this figure is it. After a few years, those that democratize start growing faster. And by the end of about 25 years, inclusive institutions is critical, but just by itself, even if you don't fix the rest of the institution, it brings enough dividends of 25%. That's a huge change. It's not going to make Nigeria Switzerland. But it is the first step. Then build on it with other institutions and it changes. And why does democracy bring this growth? It's actually important to understand that. There are a couple of things. The first is that democracy brings productivity improvements. And it does so because it's actually better at getting rid of the worst regulations, those that create oligarchies and monopolies and corruption, than dictatorships. Second, democracy does one thing that its opponents really don't like. It raises taxes. Tax revenue, and I will come back to this. Tax revenue is a lifeblood for developing countries. Developing countries need infrastructure. They need education. They need health. Those are not cheap. But if the government doesn't have legitimacy, if it doesn't want to tax its cronies, and if it cannot overcome informality and illegality, that it cannot raise taxes, it will not have the revenues to do that. You need a social pact to increase taxes. And those taxes are then going to be the lifeblood for future growth. And in fact, what democracies do typically, there are exceptions, but typically what they do is that they raise taxes and they invest those things in education and health. I can show you the education picture, but to keep the story moving, let me just show you health. Exactly the same figure. 0 is at democratization, but now what I'm showing you is infant mortality, a perennial problem in Africa. Life expectancy has become so much longer in Africa, but infant mortality is still a big issue. And you see what happens to infant mortality after democracy. It's like a huge-scale health program. It's like an amazing decline in health, infant mortality after democracy. Why? Because once you democratize, you start spending on health services in parts of the countries that were completely ignored by non-democratic regimes. So much of a good thing. Why aren't we all democratic? Why aren't we embracing it around the world? Well, many reasons. First of all, not everybody loves democracy. If you are the Chinese Communist Party or a military dictator in Africa or Latin America, you don't love democracy. Democracy means your privileges are taken away from you. If you're a crony of one of such persons, you also don't like it. But there are other barriers. So Fukuyama in '89 predicted that it was the end of history, democracy's path was clear. That turned out to be wrong. Then in the 2000s, people predicted that democracy's path was going to be supercharged because the internet, blogs, wikis, Twitter and social media, they were going to democratize communication. That we were all going to be so openly talking to each other that democracy was going to get a powerful new wind. But today, people have become more pessimistic about technology and democracy. So many, just pick on one, Israeli social scientist Yuval Noah Harari, have argued that new technologies love dictatorships. They have an affinity to dictatorships. And if you look at Tiananmen Square with the face recognition software everywhere, so that nobody can protest that, you think, how can I disagree with that? Well, it's actually much worse in the Uyghur province, where the 1 million Muslims in China are in re-education camps, forced labor camps. Everywhere is filled with face recognition problem, but I don't have a picture of it because nobody can take pictures. And China is at the beginning of implementing a social credit system, which is only made feasible by the amazing ability of technology to keep track of everything you do. The social credit system means that for every opinion and every activity that the state or the Communist Party disapproves of, you lose your credit. And if you lose your credit, you cannot get good apartments, you cannot get into good schools, you cannot get good jobs. Only choice left for you is to prostrate in front of the state. So perhaps we are leading to an age of new technology-created dictatorships, and good or bad, democracy is going to have a much harder time. And look around the world. In the US, democracy is going through a rough patch. The Philippines, Brazil, and perhaps it will come to sub-Saharan Africa, where democracy has had a rejuvenation. Certainly the Arab Spring didn't work out in the north of Africa. But I will argue that this is not the right way to think about it. And this is where I'm going to link now to the new book that James and Robinson and I will publish in a couple of months in September. And I want to summarize that to you with just one figure, and then link it to the context of technology, credit, employment, and institutions. And this is this one figure. Now this looks abstract, but I'm going to spend 5 minutes on this, because I think if I can communicate this to you, if I can help you think about the world a little differently, through the lenses of this framework, I would be so happy. So on the horizontal axis there, I have the capabilities of society. And on the vertical axis, I have the power of the state. And in the middle there is a little narrow corridor. That narrow corridor is characterized by two things. It's characterized by a balance of power between state and society. Neither society is prostrate in front of the state, nor does the state relinquish its responsibilities, its capacity, its ability to enforce law, to use its expertise through bureaucracy, to invest in education and health. It's only in that narrow corridor. And in that narrow corridor, you see very different dynamics. Dynamics where we keep on building the capacity of the state. Reduce corruption, increase expertise, increase the ability of the state to deliver the services and the social insurance that are critical in this 21st century. While society keeps up with it. You don't see that when the state is weak and absent. And you don't see that when the state is despotic like in China. Now, the narrative that you need a strong state, you need the iron will of a leader that imposes choices, that often comes from comparing societies that are in chaotic situations down there where the state is absent to places like China or Rwanda. You know, Lagos in the early 1990s with the area boards, that's in that area where the state is absent. Civil war, that's in that area. Lebanon, it's in that area. Of course, if I compare that to the order that the Chinese Communist Party brings, I love that order relative to the area boards. But that's not the only choice. The choice is the corridor. And if you are in the corridor, you use technology differently, you use credit differently, you use institutions differently. So why not move into the corridor? Why doesn't everybody move into the corridor? Actually, that's a very interesting question, and it's a deep one. And understanding and thinking about that a little bit will help us really appreciate what the future, what the promise of the future, and what the challenges of the future are. And in fact, moving in the corridor has been rare. Most of humanity has been on the lower left-hand side, just like the area was. Most of history of Africa, where humanity originated, they were stateless bands. Most of pre-Middle Ages civilizations, everywhere in Europe, certainly Asia, there were a lot of this countries, societies without states. They have been very long-lived. Why not build a state with all the benefits that it brings? Well, actually, there's a good reason for that. Because if you start building the state, there's no guarantee that you can control it. And if you cannot control it, it will tell you what to do, it will repress you, it will put you to work as forced labor. And that fear has become a critical part of human DNA. We are programmed to seek liberty because we don't want other people to tell us what to do. And I'm going to give you an example from Nigeria. Tivland. And you know what's special about Tivland is that it's not special. It's just like many, many, many other stateless societies that have existed through the ages, and archaeologists have documented. But what's special about Tivland is that we know much more about it because a couple of anthropologists, a husband and wife team, the Bohanas, went and lived there for 2 decades and have documented how Tiv politics and how Tiv society works. And it's fascinating. For those of you who haven't read it, read it. It's extremely instructive. but I will summarize it in 2 sentences. And the 2 sentences are no hierarchy. Everything in TIV society was about no hierarchy. Norms were all organized around bringing down anybody who became politically powerful, especially politically powerful, who could start telling other people what to do, and economically powerful. The whole economic institutions of the TIV were about preventing trade, because if you trade, somebody may become richer than others. And once you become richer, what is there to stop you to tell others what to do? If you became powerful, if you became rich, the TIV norms said that you were a witch. You build your power by eating the hearts of other people. You were most likely a cannibal, you had to be brought down. In a situation like that, that suspicion of power meant that it was very difficult to build a state, go without any education, any human capital, any organization, even though the TIV occupied a very large area and engaged in agriculture as well as hunting and gathering. And at the time the British came, the TIV was probably one of the poorest parts of Africa because of this complete lack of any state institutions. But what the TIV had wasn't an anachronistic, special Central African type of suspicion being studied very well. The Greeks, the ancient Greeks, the birthplace of democratic civilization, they also had the same TIV-like suspicion of power. Hierarchy, you had to fight against it. You had to control it, you had to bring down those who were getting too big for their boots. But the way that Greeks did that was very different. They found a way of institutionalizing. Don't stop the state from forming. Let the state form, but control it. Control those controlling power. Control the politicians, control the rich. And one of those institutions that they developed many, and it's fascinating that I don't have time, but the most important ones that they developed were about democratic institutions, parliaments, monitoring systems, mass politics, societal mobilization. But one of them is really interesting. It's the institution of ostracism. Ostracism, the word ostracism comes from the word ostrakon, shards of pottery, that the Greeks wrote the names of a famous person on shards of pottery. And that person, whoever was getting too big for his boots and becoming too powerful and bossing other people around, he would be exiled for 10 years. And this is the ostracism of Themistocles. Themistocles was the greatest hero that the Greeks have ever had. He defeated the Persians. He single-handedly built the navy when other people did not realize the importance of the navy. He led the navy against the Persians, and then he realized the threat that the Spartans posed. But at some point he was becoming so powerful that the Greeks decided to ostracize him and send him out of Athens. They also had a hubris law. It was illegal in ancient Greece to be hubristic towards others. So even slaves, if you went and started bossing people around, you could be jailed, and some people were even executed for being hubristic. That suspicion of power was then the key to build institutions to control the state. And the more they controlled the state, the more they built it. The services that the Greeks started providing around 5th century BC are amazing. They had a social insurance system. They had coins that were circulated by the government. They started regulating competition. They had orphanages. They had a huge road network, and they had huge public good programs. And they were all made feasible because they wanted to build the state, but then control it. And the key of that is that, like in that corridor, contested power is greater power. It's not true that if you want to build a better state, you have to follow the Chinese path. If you want to build a better state, two things are much more important than the iron will of a dictator or a or an authoritarian leader. One is getting society involved so that society monitors what the politicians are doing, so that corruption doesn't creep in, crazy ideas don't creep in, and you can kick out leaders, term-limited leaders who will not become lifelong presidents or military dictators. And the second is the cooperation of societies. The state cannot enter every nook and cranny of society and provide the services, insurance, education, unless society cooperates. And that cooperation requires trust. And that trust requires society to give its consent to the state. And that consent to be earned so that the state delivers services, and then that builds this trust. You don't solve security problems by selling bigger and bigger arms. You solve security problems by cooperating with society. And that really is critical about how to use technologies. There's nothing about AI or those face recognition cameras that says that they have to be tools of dictatorship. We decide how to use them, and that depends on this balance of power between state and society. Whether you are in the corridor, whether the state is absent, weak, and ineffective, or whether you are under a despotic state. One of the most important pieces in political science about states goes back to political scientist Charles Tilley. It's what every political science graduate student, some undergraduates learn. States made war and war makes states. And in fact, it has been applied to Africa. People have said, you know why Africa is so weak and so problematic? They haven't had enough wars. Crap. It's crap because it really doesn't take into account the fact that where you strengthen the state really means completely different things. If you're strengthening the state, starting from an area where you have a chance to enter the corridor, that's great. But if you are in the corridor and you further strengthen the state, that takes you out of the corridor into the orbit of despotism. Where you are for shocks, for wars, for technologies, it matters. And it matters for employment. You know, in the same way that AI doesn't mean dictatorship, it doesn't mean democracy. It means what we do with it. So does other technology. Robots don't mean loss of jobs. Robots are a platform. AI is a platform. Every society has to benefit from it and has to decide how to use it. Credit and finance. I am lucky to be here in the Mecca of West Africa's financial hub. And finance can be a powerful, revitalizing force for economic development. Entrepreneurship, consumer credit, access to resources for everybody. That is the heart of some of the problems that West Africa and Africa in general will have to solve. But again, it is society's choice how to use those financial tools. During the age of the high quality growth, financial intermediation in the US expanded rapidly. And providing access to many, many more credits and businesses in a way that wasn't feasible. It wasn't all equal, it wasn't all perfect. You know, when mortgages boomed in the 50s and the 60s, there was redlining that discriminated against African Americans in the US. It wasn't all hunky-dory, but it was broad-based. But then you have the 2000s, where finance becomes high-tech finance, very closely related between governments and Wall Street, and huge risk-taking and risky financial derivatives. That's a failure of using the financial tools in the same way that we don't use the technological tools. So what I'm saying is that for all of the platforms, from finance to technology to employment creating new machines, and to many, many more, it's really our control. And it's how we combine the state's capabilities and expertise, and how we build it, how we use it, and how society keeps it in check. So history isn't destiny. History matters. You cannot erase your history. But history isn't destiny. We make it. We make our own destiny. And society's involvement and the best way in that corridor through democratic means is important. And I think there's no way better to come back to Lagos. And Governor Minister Fashola is here. And this is from Lagos, I think under your government. Area boys are nowhere to be seen in Lagos. And Lagos collects much more taxes. Why? It wasn't because, I think, my understanding, you can correct me if I'm wrong, please. It wasn't because you brought your iron hand and said everybody's going to pay their taxes, otherwise the rifles will come out. It was a pact with society. I will collect more taxes and I will provide services. Trust me, I will provide services. That's what needs to be done. Everywhere in Nigeria, everywhere in West Africa, everywhere. It's in that corridor. The more the state does, the more it is responsible to be monitored, to be accountable, and to be at the service of the people. The more responsibility on the people to keep that state, that those politicians in check, even when they are well-meaning. But Nigeria isn't an island. We live in an international world. But it's the same lesson, my last lesson. The international dimension is also for us to decide how to use. Of course, I'm aware, I'm not completely unaware. Nigeria has a painful history of colonialism, foreign interventions, imperialism, slave trade, everything. That is an example of not taking from the international community being allowed to impose its worst part on a country. But it's no different today. You can decide to follow investments made on unequal terms. You can decide to follow advice to strengthen the military, weaken democracy. Or you can decide to take the international dimension in the way that it comes best for the country. And again, society has to decide. That means, in my opinion, take technology. Technology is key. Productivity growth comes from technology. Nigeria cannot realize its potential in the next 25 years in the same way that it has started making progress, unless technology improves. And that technology is going to come from growth. It's going to come with foreign capital. It's going to come with joint ventures and technical expertise. It means take investment from every country, but on your own terms. Don't let China dictate it. Don't let China tell you what to do. And it also means, and this is very important, take criticism. Take criticism. Take criticism. Not every international reaction to Nigeria is because Europeans or Americans or others are becoming imperialistic again. Turkey, the country where I was born, went off the rails because when Europeans started criticizing its lack of progress on human rights, they said, no, we're going to defend ourselves and we're going to battle down. And it was hell. Take criticism. If the international community, if Amnesty International, if Transparency International says there is corruption here, don't dismiss it, take it up to heart. Because to deal with corruption is very essential to build that trust. Build that trust, build that expertise, then you can start collecting more taxes, using them in the right expertise, and investing in health and education for high quality growth. Thank you.